oh, there might be a huge number of American Jews that actually prioritize Israeli interests over American interests, or, have dual loyalty, that's considered an anti-Semitic canard. Well, I lived it. I mean, that's insane. How could you possibly say that? This weaponization of victimhood, both to justify foreign ethno-nationalism, to justify the shutting down of dissent about it and U.S. funding of it domestically, and this strong attachment to an ethnic identity that separated us from the surrounding population here in the country, and had done that in Europe for hundreds of years, thousands of years, I guess.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast.
Joseph Jake Klein is the author of Redefining Racism from Black Sheep Press. He is a journalist behind the Jake Klein Substack. His recent essay, You Can't Be Anti-Identity Politics and Pro-Zionism, My Former Colleagues Are Hypocrites, is an important document from a conservative aimed at conservatives. A classical liberal or libertarian, Jake has produced dangerous documentaries in the past, and his YouTube channel is called Beyond Now. Jake, welcome to the Sublation Media Diet Soap podcast.
Hey, thank you. Great to be here. Just a minor correction there. Our Substack is The Black Sheep. That's where we published that piece yesterday. Not just mine, but my partners, and we have a lot of contributors, so I encourage people to check that out.
Okay, great. I looked you up. I typed in Jake Klein's Substack, and I found yours. Do you have your own as well?
That's probably just you probably just found my personal author page. There shouldn't be a Substack publication under my name. If it is, there's a lot of people named both Joseph and Jake Klein, so it might be one of them.
Okay. All right. Well, yes, go check out the Black Sheep Substack, and why don't we jump in? You've written this book, Redefining Racism, and I wanted to start by talking to you about that. But actually, before we dive into the book, I just want to point out that I'm a Marxist, you're a libertarian, but we're going to be able to talk civilly and find a lot of points of agreement. I'm going to point that out to my audience at the start here. Not that I really need to for the majority of the people who watch this channel, but some people are pretty reactive. So I just want to point out that there's going to be a lot to learn from a classical liberal in this moment. But yeah,
and for myself as well, by the way, because you'll be the first Marxist that I've talked to really in depth about this book. And, I blame Marxism for a lot of the story that I uncovered. But at the same time, I do know and have met a lot of Marxists who, they're really mad at identity politics because it's replaced class politics. So I'll be really interested now that I have this book out and, the Marxist angles of kind of the people I'm attacking in it, to learn from you and to fill in some of the gaps in my own knowledge.
Yeah, if you want to read a Marxist who is against identity politics and anti-racism as we know it, not that he's for racism, Adolf Reed would be a good place to start.
Yeah.
And there are others, but let's jump in with your book here. You titled your book Redefining Racism, and I guess the first question I have is that title an injunction or a description?
It's a description. So I am I am somebody that's, been working professionally at fighting identity politics for some years. I grew up in the 90s when it sort of felt like, at least from my perspective on life, that we were moving in the right direction, 30 years after the civil rights movement, that, there was going to be equality under the law, and, these kind of racial identities that had been dividing us over time were going to dissolve, and we were just going to see ourselves as Americans who, happen to have different skin colors or ancestral backgrounds. And that didn't seem to be the way that things were going by the mid 2010s. And I got very concerned about that because, I was attached to that vision. I thought it was a moral good. I still think it's a moral good. And, I wanted to preserve and protect that while I saw it coming under threat by, let's just call them the woke movement or whatever we want to call them. Mm-hmm. So one of the key things that I noticed that was being used towards this goal was this definition of racism that was not the one that I was familiar with, or that people that I knew when they talked about racism were ever talking about, which was power plus prejudice. Now, the racism that I'd always been familiar with was, something along the lines of prejudice or discrimination based on race or racial supremacy. But power plus prejudice, that definition was being used to say that, well, you can't be racist if your bigotry is directed at the power group, whatever that group, may happen to be, which in the United States context was white people. And it's not that I'm super concerned with defending white people or anything like that, but that immediately struck me as, well, if we don't have equal grounds on this, right? If we don't say that we're all going to treat people in the same way, and that's important, and we're going to abolish the meaning of these skin color categories, this is not really gonna work out. The white people are gonna get angry about the racism that is being justified against them, and then that's just kind of naturally gonna spark racism amongst them. That doesn't mean that it's justified that they have that reaction or ethical. It's just obviously what was going to happen. And I think we have seen that happen. I think there's been a really nasty white identity politics that has kicked up over the last year or two, really. In reaction to the woke excesses of the years prior. And I don't want to see that nasty spiral continue to worsen. So, opposing this definition, and in opposing this definition of racism, getting people to recognize the importance of that sort of racial abolitionist, let's see each other as all equally human and kind of just as humans, that's what I'm trying to resuscitate.
Yeah. So you said that this white identity politics has emerged over the last couple of years. I remember it emerging in a big way the first time Trump was elected in 2016. And even prior to that, there was a reactionary kind of movement on the right that would embrace white identity politics at times. It seems to me it goes back, that both of these kinds of moves go back quite a long way, actually. When would you say that the power plus prejudice definition of racism emerged? How did it come to be?
I want to answer that, but before that, let me address what you said about kind of the timeline on, the rise of white identitarianism. I mean, first of all, nothing just starts out of the blue. So everything grows out of something smaller. I mean, and obviously, white identitarianism in the 90s, there was David Duke, running for governor, and there were lots of bad things going on, before you go back enough before that, and civil rights wasn't passed. And, there were all sorts of, horrible white identitarianism that was, in power in this country. But, the reason I really say in the last year or two, as opposed to like 2016, the first Trump election is, I was around, I was working in conservative politics in that time. And yeah, a lot of the things Trump was saying about immigration concerned me, kicked up some of that stuff. But I think it was really relegated to the fringes from like in conservative insider perspective. I think the liberal media was really incentivized to pick up on every case that there was and highlight it, and I think make it look bigger than it was at that time. As where, if I look now at just kind of the way the discourse has evolved in terms of what mainstream figures in the conservative movement are having to respond to, like if you just look at the Twitter and social media discourse and things like that, it seems like they're faced with like actual real white identitarianism a lot more than they were when, Charlottesville was happening, and basically the entire conservative movement, condemned that stuff. So I don't see that as exactly the same. And I do think that it's gotten worse more recently than it was then. Well, do you want to address that? Or
yeah, I just want to say, like, on the left, being part of the left, we were, people like myself felt that there was quite a lot of white identity politics. And I think you're right. It was largely because it was convenient to find it. But I also think that the white identity politics would emerge out of conservative politics in various domains for quite a while, and kind of would it wouldn't define conservative reaction to wokeism, but it would come along with it in small factions. And for instance, for me, as I'm a science fiction writer as well as a political person, and I've written a number of novels and lots of short stories, and I used to be more involved with that scene and would go to conventions and was concerned about the awards. And I think as far back as 2014, there were quite a few battles around whether or not the science fiction world and the fantasy world was going to do something about its racism problem. And one way that was done was to change the statue for the World Fantasy Award, getting rid of Lovecraft because of his racist views, and bringing in Octavia Butler as a possible alternative as a model for the award. There were skirmishes over the World Fantasy Award and Hugo Award nominations, like so a number of conservatives were nominated and even won a couple of awards, and it was thought to be an abomination because they had rigged the game, because they had actually organized together to nominate people in a systematic way rather than just doing it the old-fashioned way, which is through whispering campaigns and behind the scenes organizing to push people forward. And that was thought to be an invasion by the Nazis into the world fantasy space. And there were some people who would say white identitarian things, who were leaders of this movement to try to purge woke politics from genre fiction. And this is before it ever really entered the mainstream. Then, of course, there's Gamergate, right? Probably remember Gamergate. So I guess I'm just talking about nerd culture here overall, but
nerd culture matters. The nerds have inherited the earth, or whatever. There's some line from an 80s movie.
Yeah, right. So all of this stuff, it seems like it started on the level of the culture industry and battles within the culture industry, and then it took hold of actual national politics over time. And so anyway, I wonder what your explanation is for the emergence of white identitarian politics now. And would you say the problem is woke identity politics that's generating it, or
100%. Yeah. I mean, this is completely a backlash reaction. And it was an entirely predictable one. I mean, once you open the floodgates to identity politics for some, you just inherently open it up for everyone. Like, people aren't going to limit themselves and say, oh no, those groups are allowed to ask for special advantages for themselves, and their special advantages necessarily disadvantaging, my group. I'm not going to take that. Right. And I think that is really the motivating thing. I mean, you have to mix it with a couple things. I think it's taking off with like a lot of young people, a lot of like, there's this Gen Z, like, Groyper, Nick Fuentes thing, right? And I think that is based on disillusionment with a couple things. Young people are having a lot less sex. I think that actually has, some impact in terms of, they're angry about things and they're looking for answers. And, I think that political ideology gives them a sense of meaning and strength that is missing in their lives in a very maladaptive way. That coupled with like social media addiction and economic issues, facing that generation. And you just kind of incentivize this, the status quo is broken. And I think we both agree the status quo is broken, by the way. I think we just have very different answers of where that should lead us. But when you start from that premise and you're looking for answers and you're angry and you see this woke identity politics and it seems like everybody else is against your group, that's going to lead a significant share of people to finding this ideology.
Yeah. So everything that you've said so far, I mostly agree with. It does seem to me like history is repeating itself in short order. Like when you talk about Nick Fuentes and the group. What is that? Groyper? I'm 54, so I try to ignore it.
I'm not totally. I think I've read about it, but I don't remember the etymology of that term. But it's you can think of it as Nick Fuentes. The name for Nick Fuentes' movement specifically, which is like a white identitarian, quote unquote, America first. I mean, I would call myself, America first in terms of foreign policy and other things, but they have a different interpretation of that. So like a white identitarian, America first ideology.
It's like the incel movement that was a problem around 2014 that people were really paying a lot of attention to, and that kept popping up and being addressed in various ways, and but not very successfully. Now is like taking real power for itself with the Zoomers. Like the millennials had an incel, a sex problem, but the Zoomers are like experiencing it times 10 or something like that. Is that what you
I don't have the numbers, but I know that I've seen some bad charts.
Yeah. So okay. So but so the fact is that when you talk about woke identity politics kind of bringing on this backlash, the way I think of it is that the primary problem with it is that it doesn't solve these inequities and the way in which society is dysfunctional, but rather perpetuates it. In various ways, and tries to like put a Band-Aid on some of the worst excesses, and in ways that really just shift the problem around a bit, perhaps. An example is, for me, a pretty extreme example would be a program in New York City I heard about in one of the hospitals there, where they're doing medical equity. So they're reserving certain kinds of treatments for heart disease for the disadvantaged based on ethnicity. So they're prioritizing those treatments for.
Oh my God, I've seen that personally when I was working at an organization called the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism during COVID. We would help people fight legal cases. And one of the cases we dealt with was a man in Utah who had COVID, and they had just passed a calculator, because things were being rationed. I think ventilators were being rationed in this case. And no. It must have been the vaccine. No, it was the vaccine when it was early, was being rationed.
Right.
And they put in their state calculator race. And you got 2 extra points if you were anything but white. And this man missed the calculator by 1 point. And because of that, he was put on a ventilator and almost died. So
because he got COVID, he didn't get the vaccine in time, and he was put on a ventilator. Yeah. I mean,
yeah, this is dangerous stuff. And, a lot of that was eventually ruled illegal, and they changed it, fairly quickly. But there were other places like my home city of Washington, D.C., where they knew that wasn't going to be legal. So instead, what they did was they picked the zip codes that, had, all the minority populations in them, and said, we're distributing things, unequally to those zip codes. And I don't think that's right. I mean, this was life or death. I understand some people are poorer than others, but everybody should live. It's terrible.
Yeah. I mean, the way to have done it obviously was by age and comorbidity, right? And then if you wanted to take in other factors, poverty level might have been another factor, but not above age and comorbidity, and then, yeah, but so this
I would disagree slightly on using poverty, actually, just because, poverty is a correlative indicator with certain other issues of health. You should be going directly to the relevant issues of health. And by the way, I think this is just a large scale problem that we deal with race categories specifically, is there's so many times where, people say we need to do affirmative action, because this group on average, is doing worse. And the issue is, well, okay, but there's people in that group that aren't doing worse, and you're giving the affirmative action to all of them, right? So the race is just a correlative, categorizer. What you want to actually do is look within and see, okay, what is the actual causative factor that's leading to the differences between two groups? For certain other things, that might be poverty. For health, I don't think that's poverty. And, for poverty might be correlated with diabetes, and then that's a comorbidity, and then you want to do comorbidity, right? So that would be how that would look in health. But you want to find the causative thing. Anything else is lazy and unnecessarily harmful.
Right. I mean, what you might do is something like, okay, we're going to find people who have these comorbidities by tracking poverty rates or by zip code, and say, okay, we're going to survey and find the people in this area who might have this comorbidity, because this is on average where you might find it. And so I think that would be a fine thing to do. But the main point here is that the aim of actually, let's say in the case of COVID, bring down the curve or tamping down the curve, and keeping our medical system operative and lowering the mortality rate for the nation, that became secondary to addressing equity concerns at times. And that demonstrates the ideological character of the state's response to the COVID crisis, and how deeply a certain kind of identity politics had infiltrated into the mainstream by that point. Where did it come from? I think I asked you before. And so, how did racism get redefined and when?
So the redefinition starts in the year 1970. That's the first time it's in print. And that is a big part of what started my investigation into this. This book, I used to, where I work, I would make these 2.5-minute videos, 500 word scripts about commenting on, some political issue. And I had seen somebody on the news use this power plus prejudice redefinition to argue that something couldn't be racist. And I was like, that's ridiculous. Let me do a little research on that and, make a video on it. And I saw that this redefinition was credited to some social scientist named Pat Bidall. And so I looked her up, and I found the book that this was, allegedly cited to. And it was only in 7 libraries around the country. And only 2 of them had the first edition. And one of those 2 happened to be in Baltimore. And I'm outside Washington, D.C. So I was like, I'm going to drive to Baltimore and I'm going to get it. I want to see it, right? This text is not scanned online. Nobody else has it. And I flipped through it. And what I saw this was a school curriculum. This was a school curriculum for an anti-racist education course from the year 1970. And there was a list of definitions of racism in it. And in one of them, there was just a simple bullet point. Bullet point C, power plus prejudice. And then it's surrounded by other definitions of racism. Now, that's the first time this redefinition existed in print. There were no justifications for why it was there, no elaboration on it. It was just there.
How was that document written? How did that come to be, that document? I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Well, I'll tell you that. That's a big part of the book. But anyway, so that set me on this whole investigation that turned a 2.5-minute video script into a book with like over 600 citations. So I looked into that, and tried to figure out where that curriculum came from. And basically what happened was there were horrible race riots in Detroit in the summer of 1967. Like the worst, there were race riots all around the country that year, but the worst were in Detroit, and it was like the worst ever. And in response to those riots, the business leaders and political leaders of the area, including at the time, Governor George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, they all got together and said, we have to do something about this. We can't let riots like this happen again. And what they ended up doing, amongst other things, was funding explicitly racial militant groups to do their projects, basically with the goal, they wouldn't say this outright, but it all tracks and people accuse them of this, of riot insurance, right? If we pay them off, then they won't riot again. All right. And so this woman, Pat Bidall, by the way, she's a white woman. This redefinition was created by a white person, which was also interesting to me. And what I found was that in the Detroit area at this time, there was this group of white anti-racists. They were explicitly white. One of their main leaders was this guy. This is a book called For Whites Only by Robert Terry. This is from the book 1970. If people are familiar with Robin DiAngelo, my book, basically tracks, how in tracking this redefinition, we track how Robin DiAngelo and her ideology comes to exist. Her book, White Fragility, is almost a copy paste of the content that's in this. And so that all really started in the year 1970. And that guy is there. And in this book, he has a philosophy called New White Consciousness, which is, as white people living in a racist society, we are all racist by definition because we benefit from our society's systemic racism that manifests in the inequality and outcomes of, Black people and white people everywhere. And the best a white person can be is an anti-racist racist, because we're all racists. And so, it's therefore our responsibility to deal with this basically, again, not their words, but original sin of being white to empower Black people. But what empowering Black people meant was spreading a racially militant separatist ideology. It was spreading the Black Power ideology of Stokely Carmichael. And so Stokely Carmichael had come up with this concept of institutional racism. And institutional racism doesn't mean, according to his definition, what it necessarily sounds like. Like, it doesn't mean like Jim Crow or slavery, where there's some institution that is, you know, run by racist people with racist policies and therefore creating racist outcomes. What institutional racism meant in Carmichael's definition is it's racism where you can't find the specific individual that's behind it, but you just find it through the outcomes. So if you see, you know, an unequal distribution of outcomes, then that is a sign of racism. And so these white teachers, Robert Terry was like a corporate anti-racist training educator. Pat Bidall was like a high school teacher. She wasn't a social scientist, by the way. That was totally wrong. She was just a high school teacher. And so the source I found at the beginning was just like not true. And that's also a part of this story, which is there's a lot of credibility given to this definition through an appeal to authority. And that appeal to authority is like totally false. Like, this redefinition was created by the most like non-credible, crazy people that like you could possibly imagine, who did not have like any of the relevant credentials that if you were looking for credentials, you would want to see. So anyway, so they're trying to teach those ideas to the white community. Stokely Carmichael, he gets elected the president of a very important civil rights group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This was previously run by John Lewis. It was just super important. But under his leadership, it, you know, goes a different direction. And he kicks out all the white people from SNCC and says Black people and white people shouldn't work together in the cause for racial justice, again, because Carmichael is a Black nationalist, a Black separatist. Instead, white people should go back to the white community and teach our ideas. And so that's what they did. And this power plus prejudice definition really comes out of that. It's a way to sort of bake in this idea of institutional racism, bake in for white people that, no, we don't want you thinking about racism on equal terms. We want you thinking about it in a way that will allow for, you know, Black nationalism and Black separatism. And so that's basically what I found in how you get to this single bullet point arising in the year 1970.
Did any of that have to do with the Black Belt thesis and the Stalinist movement around that time? You've heard about that before?
No.
Well, that Black Belt idea was that because, you know, there was the international communist movement, and they wanted to create revolution around the world, and there was a question like, how do you do it in America? Do you do it with the multi-ethnic working class organization, or do you grant Black people in America their own separate cultural, ethnic identity so that they now, in certain parts of the United States, in the Black Belt, could claim a nation? Should this be a struggle for, national autonomy, an anti-colonial struggle, or can you operate on the level of one nation with multiple ethnicities? And it was a debate, and the Stalinists tended to hold to the Black Belt thesis for a time, and the Trots considered it and rejected it, but there was an idea which you can see in international politics that national liberation struggles are central to revolutionary struggle overall, and so if you grant Black people in America a national identity, then their struggle becomes a national liberation struggle, which would lead to separatism or come along with, would blend well with a separatist ideology. So
Yeah.
I'm actually confirming your fears that some of this has to do with Marxism, and it does. But
yeah. So what I'll say is I didn't come across the specific thing that you're talking about, that phrasing or anything about, American Stalinists. But number one, Carmichael was a Marxist-Leninist. So, that type of Marxism philosophically absolutely underlies what happened. And also, a very similar thing to what you're describing that I came across was a group called the Republic of New Africa, which, wanted to form a Black ethno-state in those Bible Belt states. And that they don't really connect directly to the creation of, this redefinition or its spread, but they're all kind of swimming very much in the same circles.
Yeah. I do think that, you don't want to be less than careful in drawing correlations or telling a story, but I do think that the idea of a certain kind of nationalism is part of the story here.
Yes.
So in any case, tell me more about this guy. What was his name again? The guy who wrote the For Whites Only, Robert Terry. And where did he come from? Remind me if you've already said it. But.
I don't know that much about his early life. I know about his professional life. So he had a degree in divinity. And he worked for an organization called the Detroit Industrial Mission. And what this group did was, of course, at the time, there's a lot of manufacturing in Detroit, particularly auto manufacturing. And so they would go into workplaces and kind of, help the people through a Christian lens and, help labor and management get along better. They're very influenced by this social gospel movement of the late 1800s, which is sort of a socialist Christian movement. And but the corporations at first, because of that, they're very afraid. They're very afraid these people will, cause issues with the unions and stuff like that. And so it took a lot of time for the Detroit Industrial Mission to earn trust with the corporate leaders that no, we're not going to get involved in that part of things. That may or may not be where our personal feelings are, but we're just going to help people out in other ways. Anyway, their mission starts to change very much in reaction to those 1967 riots, where they feel, the Black people in our community, they're so angry, they're righteously angry, they've had to deal with all these horrible things that indeed they have. And so they get pulled into this kind of Black power sway, a lot of white, sympathetic, social justice minded people did at the time. And so they hire a Black staff member specifically looking for somebody that is not, a Martin Luther King type, but is going to be one of these more radical militant types, because that's what all the white staff members believed themselves. And so they hire this guy named Douglas Fitch. And Douglas Fitch is super radical, doesn't work well with any of the white people except for Robert Terry, and ultimately leaves the organization within 2 years because he's so radical. He just can't get along with people. But in that time, he further radicalizes Robert Terry enough in this Black separatist ideology that, he and Terry will be going into these corporate settings and teaching, new white consciousness together as new white consciousness is being developed. And so that's kind of the background of the Detroit Industrial Mission and how Terry, got so radicalized.
Yeah. So the idea here with the power plus prejudice is racism is to struggle against a power in America that's conceived of as white and intrinsically identitarian itself. That there's that there's a white nation and it is the United States, and the black people and other people of color in that nation have to struggle on the basis of their identity against it. And their struggle should not be considered racist because they do not yet have a nation. Would that be fair? A fair estimation?
I think that I think
too
that
logical?
the way that I think that the way that you're talking is really taking the Black nationalism very literally. Like a huge part of that is this idea of, yeah, we should secede from the United States like the Republic of New Africa wants, or Carmichael left the United States entirely. He moved to Africa. And we should go there and, have a Black ethno-state in Africa. But I think that a lot of the Black nationalism that I'm talking about here is sort of a weaker, like separatist Black power attitude. So it's not per se a nationalist struggle in the very literal way that you're talking about, but this kind of like, no, we don't want to assimilate. We don't want to merge into a shared culture with you. We don't want the melting pot. What we want is to retain our strong identity and to be separate and different from you. And even if we're living right next to you, we have no desire to be one people with you.
Right. And so there's a literal Black nationalist, and then there's the
cultural Black nationalism.
Cultural, like rather than a melting pot, it's a salad kind of Black nationalist.
Yeah, salad bowl. Yeah.
But salad bowl, right.
But that even people that talk about the salad bowl are still a little bit more, I would say, utopian and like we're all going to get along. I think a lot of these people really didn't want to get along. They were angry. Well,
yeah. But I mean, by the salad bowl concept came later. Anyway, it was like emerged in the 80s, maybe, I think.
I've done some research on that. I think it did arise in the 1960s before this.
Okay.
But I'm not positive on that.
I was taught it at college in the late 80s and early 90s. So, but in any case, by then I guess it had been absorbed rather than it wasn't emerging then. So this, like you said already, this is where Robin DiAngelo comes from, partly, right? You're sure she's read For Whites Only?
No, I'm not sure at all. No? What I can say is the book and the arguments that it makes are functionally identical to For Whites Only. But DiAngelo never cites any of the people that I talk about in my book, even though there's so clearly the antecedents for her idea, much more so than academic critical race theory or anywhere else. And what you see is there's a sub-variant of critical race theory called critical whiteness studies. And DiAngelo is associated with that. Some other people, Barbara Applebaum, are associated with that. And that very much picks up these ideas and carries them forward into academia. But they strip it of its roots. They make it seem like, we're scholars. We're such experts. We've thought about this very deeply. We'll write about it in, a really complex way. And they do kind of just this game that happens in academia, like you see with the postmodernists, where they write, DiAngelo doesn't write this way, but the other critical whiteness studies people do, where they write in this just really dense, like, language that doesn't really communicate their ideas better. It's not actually necessary. It's kind of this like weird status signaling game to look like experts and make people defer to them. And so I think I think, D'Angelo is a couple steps removed. I can't say if she's read this or not. I would be surprised if there's certain other disciples of Robert Terry's work that she did not directly engage in. Namely, the biggest spreader of the power plus prejudice redefinition is a woman named Judith Katz. And she's still around today. She's in her late 70s or maybe early 80s, but she's still working, doing like organizational development work for corporations and anti-racist trainings still. And I would be very surprised if D'Angelo did not have contact with her and pick up a lot of this stuff from her. But they really try very hard to hide the fact that this comes from like super radical, like white high school teachers. So, she doesn't cite for whites only, and I can't prove it.
When I come out of the radical tradition, I feel like, and the word radical gets abused. Radical means getting to the root. So like, someone who was really radical might be a very rigorous scholar as well, right? And be concerned about the truth. But then there's the pose of radical chic or something like that.
I'm inclined. I have to catch myself because you're right. I shouldn't use the word that way. And I myself refer to myself as a radical libertarian. I'm an anarcho-capitalist. So I don't. In a sense, I'm pro-radicalism, but I like it when it's good radicalism, I guess. And so I find myself using it because a very extreme instantiation of a bad ideology to begin with. And so when you get extreme in that direction, it's worse.
Well, it's funny. You just said you were an anarcho-capitalist, which that has a from my side of the fence, that has a whole slew of associations which are not very good.
I'm sure.
Right. And we should have a podcast just about anarcho-capitalism sometime soon to kind of discuss it all.
Yeah, I'd love that.
Yeah, because I before I was a Marxist, I was a kind of anarchist. I'm in the Pacific Northwest and have been here for 30 years. Of course, I was an anarchist. But I do think that it's worth exploring, the ideological roots of our ideologies and like to figure out just what these terms mean to us and what influenced us, and we might have that podcast down the road.
Absolutely.
But to get back to the consequence of this power plus prejudice definition, I mean, it seems relatively benign at first when you hear it. Like I've heard it, the first time I think I heard it, Spike Lee might have said it in some sort
That's possible
meeting, then you see it develop, and the problem again is like, what does it mean to have power? Who has power and when? Because, just like if I would just be autistic about this, like say, oh, well, sure, if someone doesn't have any power, then they can't enact their attitudes of racism, and so it doesn't matter. But of course, a group of young black men can have power and be racially motivated. They can have power in a moment on the street, for instance.
Yeah.
And
they're very convenient about how they define like what the power group is or isn't, like who holds power, because it's exactly what you described. Like in the original formulation of power plus prejudice, it doesn't get into that sort of stuff that much. Like it doesn't reckon with the fact that you could be a lone individual racist, that has the ability to, rob somebody or do whatever because they're the opposite skin color. Then as they start to face that criticism, they just kind of rejigger it to mean, no. When we say that, what we mean is on the group level. And it's like, well, why? Why are you limiting it to that way? And why are you drawing groups that are like coherent and consistent around these skin colors? And they really have no reason or no justification for it. except for the fact that it keeps the definition they want to use for other reasons in place.
Yeah. I recently came across an article about psychoanalysis called Racial Melancholia. And the premise of it was about Asian Americans facing racist discrimination and how they relate to their race, and the feeling of loss that they have as they are forced by a white supremacist culture to assimilate. And this is being taken up by contemporary psychoanalysts as some sort of great theoretical development. But then if you start to read, I started to read the essay that it was based on, and they're citing quasi-Marxists like Cedric Robinson and Afro-pessimists of different it's coming out of this black nationalist, black power movement. That's where it's originating. It's coming out of the critical race theory, which is, connected to this stuff. So it's all the initial premise goes back to what you're describing, I think, but then it gets picked up and transformed and moved around and can be applied to Asian people, which I think Asia is a fairly big continent. Who counts as Asian as an Asian American? So it's kind of striking to see how this perpetuates itself, and amongst people who, are highly educated and meant to, in other contexts are skeptical and rigorous, but not around these issues. Do you have an explanation as to why it can take hold, why it's taken hold in the elite circles to the degree that it has?
Yeah, I would say that's a question of psychology more than anything else. And so I think you start with the idea that people that are on the left politically are psychologically predisposed to have a morality of care. This is something that Jonathan Haidt has researched in his book, The Righteous Mind. And that can kind of override a lot of other moral values, as well as just short circuit, I think, some logical thinking around how that care is being delivered. Is this actually going to work? Is this actually going to be helpful in the long run, or does it just feel good? So then when you mix that with something that sounds agreeable, it doesn't have, it's just like you said, right? Like, yeah, it seems like that might make sense. And the person who's teaching it to me, they seem like a credible person. I have no particular reason to question them in this moment. And I also have a whole chapter in this book. The longest chapter is on like the psychological techniques that they use to spread this redefinition in the early days. And it was done a lot through like leading questions. Like they would ask people in these anti-racist trainings, like, what's the difference between prejudice and racism? Well, then that immediately primes them with, there must be some difference. So let me start, finding all the ways that I can separate these two concepts. And they keep kind of asking leading questions to get them to the definition that the course leader wants them to get to. That was so important to the psychological techniques that they used in the early days, was people had to come to these ideas, the whole new white consciousness philosophy, they had to come to these ideas themselves. That's what makes persuasion work. You can't jam your thoughts into somebody else's head. And so they had, they had some fairly rigorously studied techniques for how to do that. And those techniques went dangerous places, by the way. I note that, so those techniques I'm talking about were created by a group called the NTL Institute, the National Training Laboratories. And they sort of have like a bunch of different movements that spin off from the techniques that they've developed. One is this like anti-racist training stuff. They called it at the time racism awareness training, quote. Another one was a cult called Synanon. Well, like a very famous cult from the old days. It was supposed to be like an Alcoholics Anonymous like group, but for drug users. They're shaving their heads. They, do their really far version of the techniques developed by NTL is called attack therapy, where like they just yell at the person to break them down and then make that person like submissive to the group through this like really hostile attack therapy. Anyway, so, literal cult techniques are a big part of how these ideas spread. But in the modern days, it just starts with kind of that agreeable nature coupled with, this, we want to care about minorities, we want to care about Black people. And then once somebody adopts the idea because it seemed reasonable at the time, and once they start acting on the idea, then cognitive dissonance kicks in once it gets challenged. And I think that's a lot of what we saw with like corporate leaders and, government leaders. After the Black Lives Matter riots, in the summer of 2020, when this stuff really started to kick up like crazy, they'd already started to adopt it because it seemed reasonable. And then once you're telling them, no, you got all this wrong, you shouldn't be doing this, it took them a lot of time to back down from that because the cognitive dissonance was so high that they were looking for any reason to dismiss the people that were telling them, oh, this thing that you think you're doing in the name of good, actually it's bad. And so this backlash that we saw to DEI and Black Lives Matter and this definition, that was taken as a sign that look how big a problem white racism really is. They hate all this stuff that we're doing because they're all white racists. And, I know I'm saying that, yeah, white racism has gotten worse. And yeah, there was some share of people that didn't like it because they were white racists. But that was a tiny minority. I mean, there's this huge, huge majority of people that didn't like these ideas for other reasons, but yet they were dismissed through cognitive dissonance. So I think that that cognitive dissonance process is really the biggest thing by far that gets people to stick with this.
Well, we're coming up to the end of the first hour. I'm going to send you a second link for a second half of this for the Patreon version.
Sure.
If you're to stick around for that. But I want to ask you one more question along the lines of what you just said, which is that, after the election of Trump, there's a feeling that the DEI woke agenda is crippled, that it's taking its last breath, maybe. We Monday, it will all be over, right? It'll be inaugurated. And in some ways that might be true because some of these programs that are being funded through the federal government now may be gutted over the next 4 years. But it does matter how and on what basis. The question I have for you is to what degree has this power plus prejudiced ideology of racism or definition of racism taken hold even on the right? How do not just let's say not just white nationalists or white supremacists, but identity people that, like, say, J.D. Vance, who has an idea, a conception of America as an ethnic cultural identity, not necessarily restricted to any one skin color, but nonetheless an American cultural identity. How are they going to? How can we make sure that rather than just reinventing this stuff, but for the right, we actually return to some sort of civil libertarian universalist values? What do you think?
That's an interesting question. And this might be a place where we have some disagreement because of our different political backgrounds. I mean, first of all, what I'd say is I don't think this particular definition or a lot of the specific like DEI instantiations, I don't think that's going to pick up on the right so much. I think that this is kind of a uniquely leftist and ignorant centrist phenomenon. I think that on the right, it'll take the form of certain immigration policies, as well as listen, I mean, I don't really think like white nationalism is ever going to take control of this country again.
Yeah.
That would be quite a stretch, but given enough time and the right snowballs, it could happen. And that would look, something more like Jim Crow, like if it really happened. I mean, that would be a terrible disaster. But not this stuff. That's never gonna pick up on the right. I mean, in terms of whatever form it takes, though, making sure that doesn't happen. I'm a real big believer in what I think underlies the libertarian principle. I sort of think about it as libertarianism as the great compromise, which is we will not try to control you, other group, so long as the other group does not try to control our group. And we just have liberal policies by which, my community can do what my community would like to do. Your community can do what your community would like to do, but we're not using government to try to take resources from one and give to the other, or do anything that kind of takes our interest groups to kind of have unique control, because then we all start fighting. And I mean, I know that that's something Marxists are kind of interested in on the class level, is they see that class conflict as, a way to something good that might be on the other end. And I think that I don't see it that way. There's a French economist named Frédéric Bastiat, who wrote in the 1800s, who is a very important thinker for libertarians. And he wrote of the disaster of legal plunder, which he noticed kind of coming out of the French Revolution. And, this disaster of, in democracy, like each group going to the state, trying to get benefits for themselves, necessarily forces other groups to start playing that same game. And the answer to that game, where people aren't all competing with each other, all putting each other inherently in conflict, that was what he in his time called liberalism, but today we would call libertarianism. So that's what I believe, that we need to solve this.
Yeah, well, I mean, here's what I would say as with a tinge of Marxism, which is just that I would say that the way the state has developed and the administrative state has developed and the welfare state has developed has always been in response to the crises that emerge from society and from the class system in society. And as a Marxist, I'm not for unrest and rioting and, just on the face of it, or really often I'm not for those things at all. But I do think that society, both like different capitalists and the capitalists and the workers, are set at odds with each other. They're competing with each other. Workers want higher wages. The capitalists want to keep the wages low generally, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, every capitalist wants to set their price as high as they can, and every other capitalist wants the other guy to set his price as low as possible.
Yeah.
Because they have to buy from each other, right? So that's just how I think that capitalism works. And what I would say is that there is a necessity to overcome the contradictions within liberalism and in society through political action from working class people. But that isn't going to be done on the basis of ethnic identity, and isn't going to be done on the basis of opposing the aims of liberal society, but rather by attempting to fully realize them, which would mean also fully realizing kind of the idea of productivity for its own sake, the idea of creative productivity as the main drive of society, rather than the increasing the amount of work that's done, which is, I tend to think, is what happens now, that there's this kind of contradictory drive to increase the number of work hours that are out there. At the same time, there's a drive to reduce them. So anyhow, I would just say that as a Marxist, what I worry about most is that the Republicans will not go far enough in clearing away the administrative state. And as they pick up different demographics, including working class people, that they will emulate the Democrats and treat them all as voting blocks and use the state to divvy up the largesse and end up in a very similar position, maybe with different rhetoric, as what we're dealing with now. And that has tended to be the case over time. Like Reagan was, Jimmy Carter might have been the first neoliberal, and then Reagan picked it up, and then Clinton, ratified it. And so what was a right-wing ideology became a left-wing ideology. And it goes in both directions. There's more of a unity in the state in these parties than we like to recognize a lot of the time. So that would be my concern going forward, is that we're going to see a version of the same attempt to divide up the public and to control the public through the state in these various ways, even under Trump, who's claiming to, he's going to drain the swamp, and Kash Patel's going to go in there and clean up house. And I'm for that, but I just worry that it won't go really to the end, or won't. I worry that if we have too much vested in that, we're going to be disappointed.
Yeah, I have a lot I want to respond to there, but maybe that would be a fun place. Maybe that would be a nice teaser to go behind your paywall.
Yeah, that's right. We'll talk about that in the Parrot Room, which I lifted that term from from Robert Wright's podcast. He used to do the Parrot Room. We'll go to the Parrot Room. We'll go to the Patreon hour, and come join us there. And also, if you stick around and watch both podcasts, I am now doing Zoom call conversations later in the day, so you can talk to me about what you just watched if you're a patron. So remember that as well. But yeah, for everyone who's just watching on YouTube, we'll see you next week. And thanks, Jake, for coming to the Diet Soap Podcast.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.